G'day gymnastics skill seekers. This little video is all about how to start training pike flexibility. So I recently wrote a blog post on this topic, which I'll link below, but a lot of adult gymnastic skill seekers lack the flexibility to unlock gymnastic skills. So working on your pike flexibility is essential to improving forward fold capacity and also your core compression strength. Pike flexibility will have a positive impact on movements like the L-sit, like skin the cat, your handstands, your toes to bar, and a lot more. As an adult who's done minimal stretching, how do you start training pike flexibility? Two essential things that I've learned on my flexibility journey is, number one, increasing flexibility is like building strength. It takes time and it takes a consistent practice. Number two, it's never too late to increase your flexibility. So with that said, let's get to the point of the video and start to talk about how to train pike flexibility. The obvious part of pike flexibility is increasing posterior chain length. So we're talking about stretching the calves, the hamstrings, the glutes, the quadratus lumborum, the spinal erectors, and the trapezius. By stretching the posterior chain, we create the length in the muscles to improve the forward fold and to close the angle between the torso and the thighs, or the torso and the legs. So where do we start? Well, I'd suggest starting with split stance Romanian deadlifts. I like unilateral RDLs as they allow us to compare sides and test structural balance. If one side is tighter than the other, then we want to keep working on unilateral exercises to fix the imbalance before we progress to bilateral exercises. Now remember, the primary goal of the split stance RDL is to maintain a flat back. The secondary goal is to increase the range of motion with the milestone of getting the torso parallel to the floor. But we mustn't sacrifice the primary goal to achieve the secondary goal. So like I said, the milestone is to get the torso parallel to the floor with a flat back on both sides. So once you can get the torso parallel to the floor with a flat back on both sides, the next exercise or the next progression would be the split stance good morning. Now it's nearly an identical exercise to the RDL, except for the weight is placed in a mechanically more challenging position. So what do I mean by this? Well, now that the weight is placed on our back, as we hinge at the hips and we lean the shoulders forward, we're creating this longer lever, which helps to increase the force or the load placed on the posterior chain muscles. So it's going to help us strengthen the new range of motion. Now we want to be careful not to add too much weight too quickly, because this will create tension in the muscles and will actually limit the range of motion. We want to find a weight that's going to challenge us to get the torso parallel to the floor and help us start to build strength in this new range of motion that we've created. So what I like about these split stance unilateral RDLs and good mornings is not just the unilateral side of things, but also the fact that we have gravity assisting the movement or assisting the stretch. So the vector of gravity is pushing us down, and as we work through these ranges of motion, gravity is actually helping us. It's assisting us in the stretch. So seated pike stretching variations are effective, but it helps to have a certain level of flexibility before we start training the seated variations. The seated variations don't have as much assistance from the gravity vector. So therefore, I like to use a lot more standing variations when we start training our, let's say, pike and pancake, both forward folding mobility exercises. Now, both of these are very hamstring focused, both of these split stance exercises, and we want to start to target more than just like the hamstrings, calves and glutes here. So from here, the next progression I like to introduce is the Jefferson curl. Now, starting out with the Jefferson curl, I like to use the wall for assistance because it provides excellent feedback and it helps us learn how to articulate the spine. So we're talking vertebrae by vertebrae. A lot of people are quite stiff in their spine, so we want to try to release that tension and understand, okay, where are we stiff, where are we tight, and how can I get these vertebrae, these individual vertebrae, to start moving? And the Jefferson curl is good for that. I typically start with just learning or just teaching the top half of the Jefferson curl because we just want to isolate that and teach you how to set a posterior pelvic tilt so the pelvis doesn't move. Can I flex the spine without tilting the pelvis? Once we've learned that, then we can move into the full Jefferson curl where we flex the spine and then we allow the pelvis to tilt. And then we reverse the movement where we set the pelvis back in the posterior tilt and then unroll the spine. Okay, so it's a gradual progression and the wall provides great feedback. Now, common problem in pike flexibility training is the fact that a lot of people haven't heard about or aren't aware of pelvic tilt. We're often taught about hip hinging, but we're not taught about how the pelvis can actually rotate or tilt. So a lot of people haven't heard of a posterior pelvic tilt, PPT, or an anterior pelvic tilt, APT. Now, honestly, I'd not heard of it, and I'd been working in the fitness industry for years. It wasn't until I started doing more gymnastic strength training that I became aware of PPT and APT. So if you're going to start to get good at gymnastic strength training and learning gymnastic skills, you're going to need to build a really good awareness about PPT and APT. The pelvis can tilt both forward and backward. So I want you to think of the pelvis like a bowl of water. If I want to tip the water out the front of the bowl, I have to tilt the pelvis forward, tilt the bowl forward. So that is APT. If I want to tip the water out the back of the bowl, I need to posteriorly tilt the pelvis or tip the bowl backwards. Okay? Now, a lot of people struggle to get this tilt because they have tight hamstrings, tight lower back muscles, and tight hip flexors. So it really limits the range of motion in this tilting. What I like about the Jefferson curl is we actually start to work on anterior and posterior pelvic tilt. As we move down, we're trying to tilt the pelvis forward, and as we move up, we're trying to tilt the pelvis backwards. As the saying goes, if you don't use it, you lose it. So a lot of people don't use it, so they're unaware of it. We teach awareness, and then we have to start to train it, and we need to use it a lot. But like in movements like a handstand, you've got to have a posterior pelvic tilt. In movements like press to handstand, it starts in anterior and it moves to posterior. In movements like front levers, we want to have a strong posterior pelvic tilt. So it's a skill that carries over to a lot of other gymnastics movements, and it's important that we start to work on that. For the front of the pelvis to move down, the abdominals need to lengthen, and so do the hamstrings need to lengthen. The lower back muscles need to shorten, and the quadriceps and the hip flexors actually need to shorten to pull the pelvis into that anterior pelvic tilt. Thanks to our modern lifestyles, a lot of gymnastic skill seekers have weak abdominals and tight hip flexors, tight hamstrings, and tight lower back muscles. Hence, their ability to tilt the pelvis is very limited. So that's why it's a good thing to start training the split stance good mornings and the split stance RDLs, because it starts to lengthen that posterior chain, starts to stretch out the hamstrings in that position. It also encourages the pelvis to tilt forward, but there are certainly other movements we want to add to this, stretching the hip flexors, strengthening the hip flexors, stretching the lower back, thinking about activating the quads and being able to contract those quads. So there's a lot that goes into this pike flexibility training. Now, like I said, the Jefferson curl is one of the tools that helps us increase pelvic tilt awareness, but it's not the only one. Some of the best exercises I've found for improving anterior pelvic tilt are the bent knee to straight knee pike stretching variations. Examples of this are the squat to pike stretch and the standing pike block crush. Now, the primary goal of these exercises is to close the angle between the torso and the thighs. So when the knees are bent, we're taking tension out of the adductors and we're taking tension out of the hamstrings, which allows the pelvis to move into more of a anterior pelvic tilt. We're resting our belly on our thighs in that bent knee position. Now, as we start to push the knees back and try to straighten the legs, we want to fight to maintain that closed angle, torso to thighs, torso to the block, crushing that block. And the goal is not necessarily to straighten the legs. The goal is to maintain the pelvic tilt, maintain that tight angle closure, and just actively try to straighten the legs until you feel a deep stretch, maybe in adductors, maybe in the hamstrings. So this way we're training both sides of the coin. We're stretching the posterior chain, but we're also learning how to strengthen the anterior chain. We're contracting the muscles on the front of the hip to shorten that side of the body, and we're trying to lengthen the muscles on the posterior chain to stretch that side of the body. So it's a double win with these exercises. We also have gravity on our side when we're doing these standing variations. So gravity again is assisting the flexibility gains. So these are just a few of the exercises I like to use with online students who want to increase their pike flexibility. After achieving the split stance RDL milestone, torso parallel to the floor with a flat back, we move into the split stance good morning to strengthen that new range of motion. You'll also be ready to start implementing the Jefferson curl, start to train the top half, and then working to training the full Jefferson curl, and then moving into something like the standing pike block crush or the squat to pike exercises. Now, I guarantee that you'll see improvements in your pike flexibility if you can consistently train and progress these movements over a 12 to 24 week period. After that, you'll be ready for some more advanced pike stretches. Now, you might have already picked up the fact that pike flexibility has two sides: posterior chain flexibility, which we talked about in this post, and then anterior chain strength, which we touched on in this post, but we could go into a lot more with this. It's the anterior chain strength that helps to pull us deeper into the pike stretch. We must use the hip flexors and the lower abdominals to pull us down into the end ranges of that forward fold and trying to close that angle between the torso and the thighs. Now, we see this a little bit in the squat to pike and the block crush, but there are a few more exercises that I'd like to share that will going to help target this anterior chain strength. In GST, this anterior chain strength is called core compression strength. So in a future video, I'm going to talk about how we start training core compression strength. I hope you found this video helpful. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them below and I'll definitely get back to you. Happy pike flexibility training.